Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. So we were looking yesterday at the mind, the first aspect of the world around us, which, as I argued, the Christian theist is able to account for and explain, but the reductive materialist cannot explain. Today I want to look at another aspect of the world around us, which in a sense is related to yesterday's video, the mind, which the Christian theist is able to account for and explain, but which the reductive materialist cannot. I'm talking about our sense of right and wrong, our ethical sense. One of the key features of our minds is what we might call our sense of moral judgment. We believe that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. And it's increasingly clear that reductive materialism cannot explain the particular character that our sense of right and wrong has. In order to get to grips with this, we need to think just briefly about a couple of different philosophies of right and wrong that human beings might conceivably have. On the one hand, moral realism, and on the other hand, moral subjectivism. Now, what do we mean by these terms? Well, moral realism is the view that certain things are right and certain things are wrong, and it doesn't matter what your opinion about it is. Right and wrong doesn't depend in some radical way on your opinion. Killing other people without just cause is just wrong, and it doesn't matter whether the murderer thinks differently. Moral norms, in other words, transcend the varieties of culture, the subjective preferences of different people, and so on. And the alternative to this is moral subjectivism. It's the view that what's right and wrong depends radically on what you think is right and wrong. If you think it's right, it's right. If I think it's right, well, it's right, I guess, for me. Now, the problem with moral subjectivism becomes clear as soon as we imagine any real-world moral conflict. Let me give you a hypothetical example of this, which is somewhat, well, it's not the sort of thing that would actually happen in practice, but it serves to illustrate the point. Imagine a particularly philosophical burglar in your property. Imagine you came home one evening and you were horrified to discover there's somebody in the process of breaking into your house and making off with your television set or something. Okay, now, I know there's a range of different ways in which you might respond to this, but imagine, for the sake of this illustration, that the way that you responded on this particular occasion was to say, whoa, hold on just 1 second, put the TV down, get out, that's mine. And imagine that the burglar was of a particularly philosophical disposition this evening, and he said, aha, I perceive that you are a moral realist. You appear to believe that there are transcendent moral norms about stealing, in this case, which are not just held by you, but ought to be shared by me, and I ought to be bound by. Well, he says, no, I'm a moral subjectivist. I regard stealing your TV as a good thing to do, and therefore this TV is mine. I won't be putting it down and leaving it. I'll be taking it home with me. Now, what are you going to do? What you actually have here is a clash of moral worldviews. He's a moral subjectivist, and you're a moral realist. And the benefit of this particular illustration is it highlights that when push comes to shove, all of us are moral realists, apart from people who are crazy. All of us are moral realists, regardless of what we might say if we're shouting in the streets at marches and rallies and so on. What that means then, in order to justify and explain what we see in our sense of right and wrong, we must be able to give an account of moral realism. So the question we've got to ask is, can Christian theism and can reductive materialism account for moral realism? And that poses a huge problem for reductive materialists. It is increasingly clear that reductive materialism gives no grounds at all for moral realism. Just remember what reductive materialism says. It says that you're just basically a chemical and biological machine. The burglar in your a property is also just a chemical and biological machine, and there is no transcendent mind, there is no God, there is nothing which has ethical standards which, so to speak, overarches or transcends both of you, to whom you are both accountable, on the grounds of which you can say, no, stealing is just wrong, irrespective of your opinion. If you're a reductive materialist, you just can't say that. In fact, the story of 20th and 21st century ethics is basically the story of the failure of materialist attempts to give a coherent basis for moral realism. People like Sam Harris have tried very, very hard to account for these objective, transcendent standards of right and wrong, which we all feel deep down. We all know that this is how the universe actually works. But Sam Harris, as an atheist, realises, although perhaps he doesn't realise fully, how difficult it is for a reductive materialist to explain this. We can actually see why it's impossible for a reductive materialist to explain this, because reductive materialism, right at the outset, rules out the possibility that there is such a mind, a transcendent, morally aware being who holds all of us accountable. So if you're stuck with the burglar in that kind of situation, you know what's going to happen, actually. That moral dispute will be adjudicated not on the basis of philosophical discussion about right and wrong. It will be adjudicated on the basis of power, which is what always happens when people act as though there is no morally authoritative and transcendent divine being holding them accountable for their actions. When people try to deny moral realism and end up affirming moral subjectivism, disputes get adjudicated on the basis of who's strongest. And I invite you just to think a little bit about some aspects of the world that we're all currently living in now to see some examples of that. Alternatively, of course, Christian theism provides an entirely coherent basis for moral realism. Christian theism says that God's mind upholds and sustains all things. God's mind transcends all human minds, and God's mind is the one who gives to all created things, us and the burglar included, life and breath and everything else. And because he does that, we are accountable to him. He sets the standard, so to speak. He embodies in his mind the ethical value judgments which are binding upon us. In one sense, then, much of Scripture is his revelation of those ethical judgments which are binding upon us. But just leaving that aside, in principle, the Christian theist can argue for moral realism on the basis that we are all under the authority of the transcendent Creator God who made and sustains us. Moral realism can be articulated on the basis of Christian theism, whereas the reductive materialist can find no basis for it at all. And it's a very significant aspect of the world we live in, isn't it? If you want to live in a world in which moral subjectivism holds sway, you pretty soon find yourself descending into a fairly destructive dystopian vision of reality. None of us actually thinks that's the way the world ought to be, which means that we found another aspect of the world that reductive materialism simply cannot account for. I hope that's helpful, and we will take a look in the next video at another aspect of the world that a Christian theist is able to explain that a reductive materialist is not. For now though, the Lord bless you, and bye for now.